Sir Stephen Timms.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mundell. I'm grateful for the chance to speak in this debate, and I'm grateful to the Petitions Committee for having arranged it, and the Honourable Member for opening the debate. And he's kindly referred already to the Select Committee report on health assessments for benefits, which was published in April. And I do indeed want to draw on what we said in that report in my remarks in this debate. We also published the government's response to that report in June, and I've since been in correspondence with the Minister about some of the key points which arose. The annex to our report, Mr. Mundell, is well worth a look. It's based on a survey of 8,500 people who told us about their experience of using the system, of going through these assessments, including people with lifelong conditions, people's experience of the use of medical evidence, both of them topics covered in today's petitions. I'm not going to comment in this debate on the adequacy of these benefits. We have a current inquiry underway on benefit levels in the UK, which is focusing on that. But I must say that a good deal of concern has continued to be raised over the summer that the benefits we're talking about today do not meet claimants' extra costs as they are intended to. The government recognises the need to transform the system. They've recognised that in the white paper, but the reforms that have been announced, many of which I welcome, including, for example, the testing of the use of specialist assessors, picking up one of the points the Honourable Member for Carshalton made. Many of those I welcome, but the problem is those reforms are going to take years to implement, and we do need to act further, given the gravity of the problems that we've already heard about in this debate. A very important recommendation in our report, Mr. Mundell, was that assessments should be recorded by default. They should always be recorded unless the claimant chooses to opt out of having the assessment recorded. Now, the government has said no to that recommendation, I presume because it would cost a little bit more, but I really think this is a mistake. All the current providers of these assessments, the providers who are contracted by the department, they all support this change. Many of the respondents to our survey do as well. And it is, I think, the only way, really, to get to the bottom of why things go wrong so often. The Honourable Member for Carshalton quite rightly told us the statistics about the great majority of appeals against refusal decisions coming out of these assessments, the great majority of appeals are upheld. Now, that surely shows that something very fundamental is wrong here. And I think the only way we will get to the bottom of why that is for assessments routinely to be recorded in order that when things do then go wrong, it's possible to look at what actually happened in that assessment and try and learn from those errors to get it right in the future. Now, in his recent letter to me, the Minister says, and I quote, claimants may need to discuss sensitive and personal information at the assessment and may not want this to be recorded. And of course, he's quite right about that, which is why you do need a proper opt-out choice for applicants who do not want their assessment to be recorded. So I do want to ask him whether the department has considered how, if recording by default was introduced, how it would be possible to mitigate those risks which he's right to be concerned about. And I do wonder as well whether the department has looked at, if recording by default was introduced, what the impact would be on mandatory reconsideration, because I think it would be extremely helpful. If those assessments are not routinely recorded, we'll never get the feedback that's needed to put these very, very serious problems right. I do want to pick up as well the point about covert assessment that was raised both by the Honourable Member for Carshalton and by my honourable friend. I think this is a very serious and real problem. We called in our report for the government to, quote, urgently investigate the use of covert assessment by assessors The government, unfortunately, in its response, said no. I'm afraid I'm going to be using that phrase quite a lot. In what I have to say today, they say that all assessment providers strongly refute the suggestion that they undertake covert assessment. But I'm afraid these reports of this happening are much too widespread to be ignored. And I really do think the government should be having a look at that. We are concerned, Mr. Mundell, as well, about the system for claimants who are aged 16 to 18. On turning 16 in England and Wales, claimants must move from disability living allowance to PIP through a full claim process until recently, requiring a face-to-face assessment. But in Scotland, claimants can stay on DLA until the age of 18. Now, the government's white paper did acknowledge the need to help with the transition from DLA to PIP, but our conclusion was that young people in receipt of DLA should not be required to claim PIP until the age of 18, and where under 18s decide to claim PIP, then they should have light touch paper-based assessments until the age of 18. Yes, I'll gladly give way to the former minister.
Minister, and that is a really difficult fine balance, because the counter-argument is that it allows people ahead of when they turn 18 and therefore are fully responsible for their own living costs, housing arrangements, to know exactly where they are. So it's not a black and white issue.
Well, the honourable member is right. These are often quite difficult judgments. But what I'd like to know is what discussions the minister has had with ministers in Scotland about how this has, in fact, worked out in practice, and what progress the department has made on plans for 16 to 18-year-olds in work on the severe disability group. I do take the point that there are very often quite fine judgments to be made, but the view of our committee, unanimous view of our committee, was that it would be right to move to a system where applicants were not required until the age of 18 to move on to PIP. The Minister will know of concerns raised over the summer about pre-application screening questions in the new online PIP application form, which is being developed at the moment, and the fears that are being expressed that people will be wrongly put off claiming by those new screening questions, which has not been a feature of the application process before. And I wonder if he would, in winding up, whether he could say something about those concerns and also update us on progress with the online claims system for PIP, which in principle is something which I very much welcome. At the moment, claimants have 20 days to return ESA, Universal Credit forms, and a month for PIP forms. And of course, they've got to send all the supporting evidence in at the same time. And each of those forms run to tens of pages. The Association of Disabled Professionals told us this deadline is very difficult to comply with. The deadline starts from the date on the letter, not the date the letter was received, and they say, and I quote, "It is extremely rare for a letter to reach the claimant within 5 to 7 working days of the letter being sent." And now, in the pandemic, claimants had 3 months in which to return the forms. I think there were considerable advantages to that. Mind told us that extending the deadline could, quote, "reduce the need for mandatory reconsiderations or appeals by ensuring the right decision first time round." So we recommended a compromise that claimants should have 2 months in which to return forms. Unfortunately, the department in its response said no. But I wonder if the minister does recognise that the time to return forms is being reduced by delays in getting those forms sent out to people, and it's, as we've been hearing, typically at least a week. 7 of the 20 days typically disappearing before the claimant receives the request. One of the e-petitions is on, as we've heard, on considering disability benefit claims on medical advice alone. Now, I'm sure the Minister will point out, and he'll be right to point out, that as the committee heard, GPs, other medical professionals may not know exactly what is needed for a functional assessment. And we've certainly heard, and heard repeatedly, that the British Medical Association is absolutely clear that doctors do not want to take on this additional job. But the committee did want better use of another kind of evidence, and that's evidence from family and from carers. We heard that input is received, that how their input is received is incredibly patchy, as is whether their input is welcomed or not. Now, the PIP guidance for assessors is explicit that evidence from carers and family should be considered. But anecdotally, it appears quite often that it isn't. So we called on the government to review the guidance on this. And I'm pleased that on this occasion, to our recommendation, the government did respond positively. I wonder if the Minister can update us on progress with that review and when it's going to be completed. I'm glad to give way.
To my right honourable friend. I just wondered if he'd like to comment, if he's as concerned as I am about the safeguarding of our most vulnerable claimants when they apply for PIP or for work capability assessment, and their inability in some cases to actually complete that process, and the consequence of that. We're seeing an increasing number of prevention of future death reports from coroners directly related to either work capability assessment or to the personal independence assessment process as well.
My honourable friend is absolutely right, and she's done a great deal of extremely valuable and important work on this subject on our select committee and indeed in the chamber as well. And I do share her concerns, and as she knows, because it was substantially at her instigation, we are undertaking an inquiry specifically on the safeguarding of vulnerable claimants to look at those issues. So I do share her concerns. They're reflected in our report. And actually that point about the time that people have to send the forms back is an important one for people who are struggling for the kind of reason that she sets out to complete the forms in the very tight deadline that is set at the moment. Shortly before we published our report, the department published its long-awaited health and disability white paper. The Minister knows, because he's kindly given me the opportunity to tell him about it, of my concern that people may miss out on support under the new system as they won't meet the eligibility criteria whilst they do under the current system. And quite how that's going to be resolved is not yet clear. But I do wonder if the Minister can today provide reassurance that claimants and groups representing claimants will be involved in developing the new system. So Mr Mundell, there's much more I could say based on our report, but I think it's absolutely clear, and it's clear already from this debate, that these assessments are not working well. We need very significant changes to make them work better in the future, and I do hope that the recommendations in our report, that more of them will be accepted before too long than have been as yet.
Yeah.